For centuries, darkness had been the sailor's refuge, a cloak of invisibility that turned the vast ocean into a sanctuary where ships could slip away from danger. Japanese convoy captains knew this ancient truth well. When the sun dipped below the horizon in the Pacific, they breathed easier, confident that their vessels would vanish into the impenetrable night. American submarines, they believed, were blind predators, rendered harmless by the absence of light. But in the shadow-draped waters of 1943, something impossible began happening. Ships that should have been invisible were exploding with terrifying precision. Torpedoes were finding their marks in complete darkness, as if guided by an unseen eye. The Japanese couldn't comprehend it. Their doctrine, their experience, everything they knew about naval warfare said this was impossible. What they didn't know was that American submarines had gained a supernatural advantage, a technology so revolutionary it would rewrite the rules of undersea warfare forever. The night was no longer safe. It had become a killing field. The year was 1942, and the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean had become the most critical theater of the Second World War. Stretching from the coast of California to the shores of Japan, this immense battlefield covered nearly 64 million square miles of water, an area larger than all the world's landmasses combined. Within this maritime wilderness, the United States Navy faced a challenge that threatened to undermine the entire Allied strategy in the Pacific: how to strangle Japan's war machine by cutting off the vital supply lines that fed its empire. Japan's conquests had been breathtaking in their speed and scope. By mid-1942, the rising sun flag flew over territories from Burma to the Solomon Islands, from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies. This sprawling empire required a constant flow of resources: oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from the Philippines. Hundreds of cargo vessels, tankers and troop transports crisscrossed the Pacific daily, forming the circulatory system of Japan's military might. Without these supplies, the Imperial Japanese Navy would run out of fuel, the factories would fall silent, and the armies would starve. The American submarine force had been tasked with severing these arteries, but they faced obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The most fundamental problem was devastatingly simple: submarines couldn't see in the dark. During daylight hours, a submarine commander could use his periscope to spot enemy vessels on the horizon, calculate firing solutions, and launch torpedoes with reasonable accuracy. But periscopes were optical instruments. They required light to function. When night fell across the Pacific, American submarines became effectively blind. This wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was a strategic catastrophe. Japanese convoy commanders had quickly learned to exploit this weakness. Intelligence reports from captured documents and interrogated prisoners revealed a consistent pattern. Japanese ships traveled primarily at night, hugging coastlines and island chains where American submarines dared not follow in darkness. During the day, they would anchor in protected harbors or continue their journeys with heavy air cover. The statistics were damning. Fewer than 30% of American submarine patrols resulted in successful attacks, and the vast majority of those occurred during daylight hours. Commander Edward Beach, a submarine officer who would later become one of the war's most decorated submariners, wrote in his patrol report from August 1942, "Sighted convoy at dusk, range approximately 8,000 yards, attempted to close for attack but lost visual contact as darkness fell. Spent 6 hours searching blindly, listening on hydrophones, but could not reacquire target. Convoy escaped. This marks the 4th time this patrol we have lost contact with enemy vessels due to nightfall." The frustration was palpable throughout the submarine force. These were some of the Navy's best and brightest officers, commanding sophisticated vessels that represented the cutting edge of naval technology. Yet they were being outmaneuvered by a simple fact of nature: the absence of light. The Japanese advantage at night was so pronounced that some American submarine commanders began referring to the hours between sunset and sunrise as the enemy's shift. At the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., a small group of scientists and engineers had been wrestling with this problem since before the war began. Dr. Robert Page, a physicist who had been instrumental in developing early radar systems for surface ships, understood that the solution lay in electromagnetic radiation. Radar, an acronym for radio detection and ranging, used radio waves to detect objects at a distance. The principle was elegant: transmit a pulse of radio energy, wait for it to bounce off a target, and measure the time it took for the echo to return. Since radio waves traveled at the speed of light, this time delay could be converted into distance with extraordinary precision. Surface ships had been using radar since 1940, and it had already proven its worth in several naval engagements. But submarines presented unique challenges. A radar system for a surface ship could be large, powerful, and mounted high on a mast, where its antenna could sweep the horizon unobstructed. A submarine, by contrast, had to operate in an environment where space was at an absolute premium, where every pound of weight affected diving characteristics, and where any equipment exposed above the waterline had to withstand the crushing force of deep dives and the corrosive assault of seawater. The first attempts to mount radar on submarines had been failures. In early 1942, the USS Gudgeon had been fitted with an experimental SD radar set designed to detect aircraft. The system was bulky, unreliable, and its antenna, a large bedspring-like structure mounted on the periscope shears, created so much drag that it reduced the submarine's surface speed by nearly 2 knots. Worse, the radar's range was limited to about 10 miles, and it couldn't distinguish between a large ship and a small island. Several submarine commanders who had tested early radar systems filed reports recommending against their installation, arguing that the disadvantages outweighed any potential benefits. But Dr. Page and his team at the Naval Research Laboratory refused to accept defeat. They knew that the fundamental physics were sound. Radio waves didn't need light to propagate, and they could detect metal objects with remarkable precision. The challenge was engineering. How to create a radar system compact enough to fit on a submarine, powerful enough to detect ships at useful ranges, precise enough to provide accurate targeting information, and rugged enough to survive the brutal conditions of submarine warfare. In the spring of 1942, Page's team achieved a breakthrough. They developed a new radar system designated SJ, which operated at a wavelength of 10 centimeters, much shorter than previous submarine radars. This shorter wavelength allowed for a smaller antenna and provided much better resolution, meaning it could distinguish between closely spaced objects and provide more accurate range information. The entire system, including the transmitter, receiver, and display console, was designed to fit within the cramped confines of a submarine's conning tower. The SJ radar's specifications were impressive on paper: maximum range of approximately 15 miles for a large ship, accuracy within 50 yards, and the ability to provide continuous tracking of multiple targets. The antenna was a small parabolic dish that could be raised and lowered through a special mast, similar to a periscope. When submerged, the mast would be retracted, and the system would be protected from the crushing pressure of the deep. But paper specifications meant nothing in the chaos of actual combat. The submarine force had been burned before by equipment that worked perfectly in laboratory conditions, but failed catastrophically at sea. There was deep skepticism among submarine commanders, many of whom viewed radar as an unnecessary complication that would distract from the fundamental skills of seamanship and torpedo marksmanship. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific, was not a man easily swayed by theoretical arguments. A veteran submariner with decades of experience, he had seen too many promising technologies fail when confronted with the harsh realities of war. But he also understood that the current situation was untenable. American submarines were sinking Japanese ships at a rate far below what was needed to impact Japan's war effort significantly. If the submarine force couldn't find a way to operate effectively at night, the campaign to strangle Japan's supply lines would fail, and the war in the Pacific would drag on for years, costing countless American lives. In June 1942, Lockwood made a decision that would change the course of the Pacific War. He ordered that the USS Haddock, a Gato-class submarine preparing for its third war patrol, be fitted with one of the new SJ radar systems. The installation would be done at Pearl Harbor, and the Haddock would conduct operational tests during its patrol in the waters around the Japanese-held Marshall Islands. If the radar proved its worth, it would be installed on every submarine in the Pacific Fleet. If it failed, the program would be abandoned, and the submarine force would have to find another solution to the night blindness problem. Commander Arthur Taylor, the Haddock's skipper, received the news with mixed feelings. He was a pragmatist who understood the need for better night-fighting capabilities, but he was also concerned about taking an untested system into combat. His crew would have to learn to operate and maintain the radar while simultaneously conducting war patrols in enemy-controlled waters. There would be no second chances, no opportunity for do-overs. If the radar failed at a critical moment, it could mean the difference between a successful attack and a depth charge attack that sent the Haddock to the bottom. The installation took 3 weeks. Navy technicians worked around the clock, cutting holes in the Haddock's pressure hull to route cables, mounting the radar mast on the periscope shears, and installing the display console in the conning tower. The crew watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as their boat was transformed into a floating laboratory. Some sailors grumbled that the radar would make them a target. The Japanese might be able to detect the radar's transmissions and home in on them. Others worried that the additional equipment would make the boat top-heavy and affect its diving characteristics. On July 15, 1942, the USS Haddock departed Pearl Harbor on what would become one of the most significant patrols of the Pacific War. Aboard were 75 officers and men, 24 torpedoes, and one experimental radar system that would either revolutionize submarine warfare or prove to be an expensive failure. As the Haddock slipped beneath the waves and headed west toward the Japanese-held Marshall Islands, no one aboard, not Commander Taylor, not the radar technicians, not even Admiral Lockwood back at Pearl Harbor, fully understood that they were about to demonstrate a capability that would terrify the Japanese Navy and turn the Pacific night from a sanctuary into a hunting ground. The stage was set for a transformation that would shift the balance of power in the Pacific, one radar pulse at a time. The USS Haddock cut through the dark Pacific waters at 14 knots, her diesel engines rumbling as she made the long transit from Pearl Harbor to her patrol area near the Marshall Islands. It was July 28, 1942, 13 days into the patrol, and the crew had settled into the familiar rhythm of submarine warfare. Long hours of tedium, punctuated by moments of intense alertness whenever a potential target appeared on the horizon. But this patrol was different. In the cramped conning tower, squeezed between the periscope stands and the torpedo data computer, sat a grey metal console that looked like something from a science fiction novel. The SJ radar display featured a circular cathode ray tube that glowed an eerie green in the darkness. Radiating from the center were range rings marked in thousands of yards, and a bright line swept around the screen like the hand of a clock, painting a picture of everything the radar could see. Lieutenant James Harper, the Haddock's executive officer, had been designated as the primary radar operator. A graduate of MIT with a degree in electrical engineering, Harper was one of the few officers aboard who understood the theoretical principles behind radar technology. But understanding theory and operating equipment in combat conditions were vastly different things. For the first week of the patrol, Harper spent hours each night staring at the radar screen, trying to interpret the confusing jumble of returns that appeared on the display. The ocean, it turned out, was not the empty void that Harper had imagined. The radar screen showed returns from waves, from rain squalls, from low-hanging clouds, and from the countless small islands that dotted the Pacific. Distinguishing a ship from this clutter required skill, experience, and intuition, qualities that could only be developed through practice. Harper filled notebook after notebook with observations, sketching the radar returns and noting the conditions under which they appeared. Slowly, painfully, he began to develop a sense for what was real and what was noise. The first major test came on the night of July 29th. The Haddock was running on the surface, charging batteries and making transit to a new patrol area, when Harper noticed something unusual on the radar screen. At a range of approximately 12,000 yards, nearly 7 miles, a solid return appeared, moving steadily across the display. Unlike the fuzzy, indistinct blobs created by weather or sea clutter, this return was sharp and bright, with clear edges that suggested a large metal object. "Captain to the conning tower," Harper called down the voice tube, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. "Possible contact on radar, bearing 345, range 12,000 yards. Commander Taylor climbed up from the control room, his eyes taking a moment to adjust to the red lighting of the conning tower. He studied the radar display, watching as the bright pip moved slowly across the screen. "You're sure that's not an island?" he asked. The Marshall Islands were notorious for their irregular shapes and unexpected outcroppings, and more than one submarine commander had wasted torpedoes shooting at stationary land masses. "It's moving, sir," Harper replied, pointing to the successive positions where the return had appeared. "Bearing is changing steadily. Speed approximately 8 knots, course roughly 180. That's a ship." Taylor felt his pulse quicken. If Harper was right, they had detected an enemy vessel at a range far beyond what was possible with optical instruments in darkness. The night was overcast, with no moon and visibility limited to perhaps 1,000 yards. Under normal circumstances, the Haddock would have been completely blind, unable to detect the target until it was practically on top of them, far too close for a safe attack approach. "Sound general quarters," Taylor ordered. "Man battle stations torpedo. Hilton, come left to course 320, all ahead full. Let's close the range and see what we've got." The Haddock surged forward, her 4 diesel engines driving her through the dark water at 17 knots. In the conning tower, the fire control party assembled, the torpedo data computer operator, the helmsman, the plotting team, and Harper at the radar. Every 2 minutes, Harper called out updated range and bearing information, and the plotting team translated this data into a firing solution. This was the moment of truth. The SJ radar wasn't just detecting the target, it was providing continuous tracking information that allowed the fire control team to calculate the target's course, speed, and range with unprecedented accuracy. In daylight attacks, this information came from visual observations through the periscope, with the submarine commander estimating angles and distances by eye. It was an art as much as a science, requiring years of experience and a healthy dose of luck. But the radar removed the guesswork. The numbers it provided were precise, objective, and continuous. At 8,000 yards, Taylor raised the periscope for a quick look. The night was so dark, he could barely see the bow of his own submarine, let alone a target miles away. He lowered the periscope and turned to Harper. "I can't see a damn thing. We're completely dependent on your radar. What's the range now?" 7,500 yards, sir, bearing 342. Target course is 175, speed 8 knots. It's a steady contact. Definitely a ship." Taylor made his decision. They would conduct the entire attack using radar alone, without visual confirmation of the target. It was a radical departure from standard submarine doctrine, which required positive visual identification before launching torpedoes. But if the radar was as accurate as the technicians claimed, it should work, and if it didn't work, they would learn valuable lessons that could be applied to future patrols. "Set depth on all torpedoes to 10 feet, Taylor ordered. "We'll fire a spread of 4 fish from the forward tubes. Torpedo run will be approximately 3,000 yards. Harper, I need continuous range and bearing updates. Call them out every 30 seconds. The haddock continued to close. Her bow pointed at an invisible target somewhere in the darkness ahead. In the forward torpedo room, 4 Mark 14 torpedoes sat in their tubes, their gyroscopes spinning, their warheads armed with 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. The torpedomen stood ready, their hands on the firing levers, waiting for the command that would send 2,700 pounds of steel and explosive hurtling toward the enemy. At 4,000 yards, Harper's voice took on an urgent tone. "Captain, I'm getting another return. Bearing 355, range 9,000 yards. There's a second ship. This is a convoy." Taylor's mind raced. 2 ships meant this was likely a cargo convoy, possibly with escorts. The tactical situation had just become significantly more complicated, but it also meant a greater opportunity. If they could sink both ships, it would be a devastating blow to Japanese logistics and a powerful demonstration of the radar's capabilities. "We'll take them one at a time," Taylor decided. "Maintain course toward the first target. After we shoot, we'll swing around and engage the second contact." At 3,000 yards, the fire control solution was as good as it was going to get. The plotting team had calculated the target's course and speed based on multiple radar observations, and the torpedo data computer had generated firing angles for each of the 4 torpedoes. The spread would cover a 200-yard section of ocean, ensuring that even if the target maneuvered slightly, at least one torpedo would find its mark. "Final bearing and shoot," Taylor commanded. Harper's voice was steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Bearing 340, range 3,200 yards, target angle 90 starboard. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3, fire 4. The haddock shuddered as compressed air ejected the torpedoes from their tubes. 4 wakes of bubbles streamed away into the darkness, invisible to the naked eye, but clearly marked on the radar screen as they raced toward the target. The fire control party counted down the seconds, 90 seconds to impact at the calculated torpedo speed of 46 knots. Then, disaster struck. At 70 seconds into the torpedo run, Harper saw something on the radar screen that made his blood run cold. The target return was changing, not in the way a ship would change if it were maneuvering, but in a way that suggested the radar was malfunctioning. The return began to break up into multiple smaller returns, then disappeared entirely, then reappeared in a slightly different position. "I've lost the target!" Harper called out, his voice cracking with frustration. "The return is breaking up. I don't know if it's the radar or if something's wrong with the target." Taylor grabbed the periscope handles and raised the scope, pressing his eye to the rubber eyepiece and scanning the darkness ahead. Nothing. Just impenetrable blackness. They were blind again, just as they had been before the radar was installed. Somewhere out there, 4 torpedoes were running toward a target they could no longer see, and they had no way of knowing if the attack would succeed or fail. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. At the calculated impact time, the entire crew held their breath, listening for the distinctive thump of a torpedo detonation. But there was only silence, broken by the rumble of the haddock's diesels and the rush of water along the hull. 30 seconds passed, a minute, 2 minutes, no explosions. The attack had failed. "Secure from battle stations," Taylor said quietly, the disappointment evident in his voice. "Harper, what the hell happened to the radar?" Harper was already troubleshooting, his hands moving over the radar controls as he checked connections and settings. "I don't know, sir. The system just started giving erratic returns. It might be a problem with the antenna rotation mechanism or possibly water intrusion in the waveguide. I need time to diagnose it properly." For the next 3 hours, while the Haddock moved away from the area to avoid any possible escorts, Harper and the boat's electricians worked frantically on the radar system. They discovered that seawater had indeed leaked into one of the antenna connections, causing intermittent short circuits that disrupted the radar's operation. It was exactly the kind of problem that the laboratory technicians had worried about, but hadn't been able to fully test in controlled conditions. The ocean was a harsh mistress, and she had no patience for delicate electronic equipment. By dawn, Harper had jury-rigged a temporary fix using electrical tape and sealant compound. The radar was working again, but everyone aboard understood that this was just the first of many challenges they would face. The SJ radar was a revolutionary technology, but it was also temperamental, fragile, and utterly dependent on components that had never been designed to operate in the brutal environment of a submarine at war. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself with frustrating regularity. The Haddock would detect a target on radar close for an attack and then experience some kind of equipment failure at a critical moment. The antenna motor burned out during one approach, leaving them unable to scan for targets. The display tube failed during another attack, forcing Harper to navigate using only audio signals from the radar receiver. Salt spray corroded electrical connections, vibration loosened mounting bolts, and the constant diving and surfacing subjected the equipment to stresses that no laboratory test could replicate. But slowly, painfully, the crew learned. Harper developed a pre-dive checklist that ensured all radar components were properly secured and sealed. The electricians fabricated waterproof covers for vulnerable connections. The torpedomen learned to coordinate their actions with radar observations, developing new procedures for attacks conducted entirely without visual reference. Commander Taylor refined his tactics, learning when to trust the radar and when to rely on traditional methods. By the end of August, the Haddock had conducted 6 radar-assisted attacks. 3 had resulted in confirmed sinkings: a cargo ship, a tanker, and a troop transport. 2 had failed due to equipment malfunctions. 1 had missed due to errors in the fire control solution. It was far from perfect, but it was progress. More importantly, the crew had accumulated thousands of hours of operational experience with the radar system, identifying problems and developing solutions that could be passed on to other submarines. When the Haddock returned to Pearl Harbor on September 12, 1942, Commander Taylor submitted a detailed patrol report that ran to over 100 pages. His conclusion was unequivocal. The SJ radar, despite its current limitations and reliability issues, represents a fundamental advance in submarine warfare capabilities. With proper training, maintenance procedures, and continued technical refinement, this system will allow our submarines to operate effectively at night, negating the enemy's current tactical advantage in darkness. I strongly recommend immediate installation of SJ radar on all fleet submarines, accompanied by intensive training programs for operators and maintenance personnel. Admiral Lockwood read the report with growing excitement. The radar wasn't perfect, but it worked. And more importantly, it could be made to work better. He immediately ordered an accelerated installation program, with priority given to submarines operating in the most heavily trafficked Japanese shipping lanes. By the end of 1942, 20 submarines had been fitted with SJ radar. By mid-1943, the number had grown to over 50. And with each installation, the lessons learned from the Haddock's pioneering patrol were incorporated, making the systems more reliable, more effective, and more deadly. The night was about to become a very dangerous place for Japanese shipping. In the dimly lit operations room of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 4th Fleet headquarters in Truk Lagoon, Captain Takeo Yamamoto stared at the map spread across the table before him with growing unease. Red pins marked the locations where Japanese merchant vessels had been sunk over the past 3 months, and the pattern was deeply disturbing. What had once been scattered, opportunistic attacks during daylight hours had transformed into something far more sinister, a systematic campaign of nighttime destruction that defied everything Yamamoto understood about submarine warfare. It was February 1943, and the losses were mounting at an alarming rate. In January alone, 17 cargo ships and tankers had been torpedoed in darkness, their crews reporting that they had received no warning, seen no periscope, detected no submarine on the surface. The attacks came with devastating precision, torpedoes striking vital areas of the hull, multiple hits that sent ships to the bottom within minutes. Survivors spoke of invisible predators that struck from the black void of night and vanished without trace. Yamamoto had served in the Imperial Navy for 23 years. He had studied at the Naval War College, commanded destroyers, and spent 2 years as a naval attaché in London, where he had observed British naval operations firsthand. He understood submarine tactics as well as any officer in the Japanese fleet, and everything he knew told him that what was happening in the Pacific was impossible. "The Americans cannot see in the dark," he said to Commander Hiroshi Nakamura, his intelligence officer. "Their submarines have no night fighting capability. This is established doctrine, confirmed by our own observations and by captured American documents. Yet these attacks continue with increasing frequency and accuracy. How do you explain this?" Nakamura shuffled through a stack of reports, his face troubled. "Sir, we have interrogated survivors from 14 different ships sunk in night attacks. Their testimonies are remarkably consistent. They report no visual sighting of submarines before the attacks, no periscope wakes, no silhouettes against the horizon. Several captains stated that visibility was less than 500 meters due to darkness or weather conditions. Under such circumstances, a submarine attack should be impossible." "Should be impossible," Yamamoto repeated, his voice heavy with frustration. "And yet it happens. Night after night our ships are being sunk by an enemy that apparently does not need eyes to see. What are the theories?" Nakamura consulted his notes. "There are several possibilities being discussed, sir. Some officers believe the Americans have developed superior night optical equipment, perhaps advanced binoculars or periscopes with enhanced light-gathering capabilities. Others suggest they may be using sound detection equipment to locate our ships, though this seems unlikely given the accuracy of their torpedo attacks." "And what do you believe, Commander?" Nakamura hesitated before answering. "Sir, there have been unconfirmed reports from some merchant captains of strange electronic interference on their radio equipment immediately before attacks, brief bursts of static, unusual patterns that don't correspond to any known radio transmissions. I have also reviewed intelligence reports from our agents in the United States. There are indications that the Americans have been developing something called radar, a device that uses radio waves to detect objects at a distance." Yamamoto's eyes narrowed. "I am familiar with radar. The British used it during their defense against our German allies' air attacks. Large installations on the coast, mounted on towers, used to detect aircraft. Are you suggesting the Americans have miniaturized this technology sufficiently to mount it on submarines?" "It seems improbable, sir, but it would explain the pattern of attacks. If American submarines possess radar, they could detect our ships at ranges far beyond visual distance, even in complete darkness. They could track our movements, calculate firing solutions, and launch torpedoes without ever exposing a periscope." Yamamoto walked to the window, gazing out at the anchorage, where dozens of Japanese warships lay at anchor. The idea that the Americans had achieved such a technological breakthrough was deeply troubling. But it was even more troubling that Japanese naval doctrine had no answer for it. The entire defensive strategy for merchant convoys was predicated on the assumption that submarines were vulnerable at night, that darkness provided protection. If that assumption was wrong, then every convoy route in the Pacific was a death trap. "Have we detected any unusual radio emissions from American submarines?" Yamamoto asked. "No, sir. Our radio direction finding stations have detected nothing out of the ordinary. If the Americans are using radar, either its emissions are too weak to detect at long range, or they are using frequencies we are not monitoring. This was the crux of the problem. The Japanese Navy had invested heavily in radio intelligence and direction-finding capabilities, but those systems were designed to detect conventional radio transmissions, voice communications, Morse code signals, the kinds of emissions that Japanese equipment was designed to produce. If American radar operated on different frequencies or used different modulation techniques, Japanese monitoring stations might be completely blind to it. 300 miles to the east, aboard the cargo ship Taiyo Maru, Captain Kenji Sato was experiencing his own moment of profound confusion. His ship, loaded with rubber and tin from the Dutch East Indies, was part of a 6-vessel convoy making the run from Rabaul to Truk. The convoy was traveling at night, as doctrine dictated, with all ships maintaining strict radio silence and running without lights. The sea was calm. Visibility was poor due to low clouds, and Sato felt reasonably confident that his ship was safe from submarine attack. At 02:30 hours, that confidence was shattered. A massive explosion amidships threw Sato against the bulkhead of the bridge, and he felt the deck lurch beneath his feet as the Taiyo Maru took on a severe list to starboard. A second explosion followed seconds later, this one forward near the bow, and Sato knew immediately that his ship was doomed. "Abandon ship!" he shouted to his crew. "All hands to the lifeboats!" As the Taiyo Maru settled into the water, her bow already submerged and her stern rising at a steep angle, Sato scanned the surrounding ocean for any sign of the submarine that had attacked them. Nothing. The night was as black as ink, the sea empty of any visible threat. It was as if they had been struck by a ghost, an invisible demon that killed without warning and vanished without trace. Sato and 37 of his crew made it to the lifeboats. The Taiyo Maru sank in less than 8 minutes, taking 12 men with her. As they rowed away from the sinking ship, one of the younger sailors pointed to the sky and said, "Captain, do you think the Americans have aircraft that can see in the dark? Perhaps they spotted us from above and radioed our position to a submarine." Sato considered this possibility. It would explain how the submarine had found them in darkness. But it raised other questions. Why had they heard no aircraft engines? Why had the submarine been able to achieve such a perfect firing position without being detected? And if American aircraft could see in the dark, why weren't they attacking Japanese ships directly instead of vectoring submarines to targets? The more Sato thought about it, the less sense it made. But one thing was certain. The rules of naval warfare had changed, and the Japanese Navy had not yet figured out the new rules. Back at Truk, Captain Yamamoto was receiving similar reports from across the Pacific. In the waters off the Philippines, the tanker Kyoei Maru had been torpedoed at midnight in conditions of near-zero visibility. Off the coast of New Guinea, 3 cargo ships in a convoy had been sunk in a coordinated night attack that suggested the American submarine had been tracking the entire convoy simultaneously, something that should have been impossible without visual contact. In the waters near the Marianas, a troop transport had been hit by 4 torpedoes in rapid succession, all striking within a 20-meter section of the hull, indicating a level of accuracy that exceeded anything previously seen in submarine warfare. Yamamoto compiled all of these reports into a comprehensive analysis that he submitted to Admiral Minechi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. His conclusions were stark. The enemy has developed a capability that allows their submarines to detect and attack our vessels in conditions of darkness and poor visibility, with accuracy approaching that of daylight attacks. The nature of this capability is unknown, but the evidence suggests some form of electronic detection equipment, possibly radar. Current defensive measures are inadequate. Recommend immediate research into detection and countermeasures for enemy radar systems, and revision of convoy routing procedures to minimize exposure to submarine attack. Admiral Koga read the report with a mixture of skepticism and concern. The idea that American submarines possessed radar seemed far-fetched. Surely Japanese intelligence would have detected such a significant technological development. But the loss statistics were undeniable. In the first 2 months of 1943, Japanese merchant shipping losses had increased by 47% compared to the same period in 1942, and the vast majority of those losses occurred at night. Koga convened a meeting of his senior staff to discuss the situation. The debate was heated. Some officers insisted that the increased losses were simply due to more aggressive American submarine tactics and better training, not any technological advantage. Others argued that the Americans might be using spies or coast watchers to report ship movements, allowing submarines to position themselves for night attacks. A few, like Yamamoto, believed that radar was the most likely explanation. Commander Takeshi Naito, a technical specialist who had studied electrical engineering at Tokyo Imperial University, was asked to assess the feasibility of submarine-mounted radar. His analysis was sobering. Theoretically, it is possible to create a radar system compact enough to fit on a submarine. The British have demonstrated that radar can be miniaturized for use on aircraft. However, such a system would require significant electrical power, sophisticated electronics, and a rotating antenna that could scan the horizon. The engineering challenges are substantial. If the Americans have achieved this, it represents a remarkable technical accomplishment. But is it detectable? Koga asked. Can we build equipment that would warn our ships when they are being observed by enemy radar? Naito shook his head. Not quickly, sir. We would first need to determine what frequencies the American radar uses, what modulation techniques they employ, and what power levels they operate at. Then we would need to design, build, and test detection equipment. This would take months, possibly years. And even then, detection would only provide warning. It would not prevent the attack. The meeting ended without any clear resolution. The Japanese Navy was facing a threat it didn't fully understand and couldn't effectively counter. Doctrine that had been developed over decades was suddenly obsolete, but there was no new doctrine to replace it. Ship captains were left to navigate by instinct and hope, knowing that the darkness that had once protected them might now conceal an invisible hunter. In the wardrooms of Japanese merchant ships, sailors began to speak in hushed tones of the ghost submarines that could see through darkness and strike without warning. Some claimed the Americans had made a pact with demons. Others believed they had captured Japanese scientists and tortured them into revealing secret technologies. The truth, that American ingenuity and industrial capacity had produced a technological advantage that the Japanese couldn't match, was somehow more frightening than any supernatural explanation. By March 1943, Japanese merchant ship captains were reporting a new phenomenon, a sense of being watched, even when no enemy was visible. They described an oppressive feeling of vulnerability, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, an American submarine might be tracking their every move with electronic eyes they couldn't see and couldn't evade. The psychological impact was profound. Crews became nervous and jumpy, captains second-guessed their routing decisions, and the overall efficiency of the Japanese merchant marine declined as ships took longer, more circuitous routes in a futile attempt to avoid submarine attacks. The night, once a refuge, had become a source of terror, and the Japanese Navy still had no answer. The USS Wahoo sliced through the heavy seas of the East China Sea, her SJ radar antenna rotating steadily as she hunted for targets in the shipping lanes between Japan and the Asian mainland. It was March 19, 1943, and Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton was on his 5th war patrol, having already established himself as one of the most aggressive and successful submarine commanders in the Pacific Fleet. But tonight, Morton faced a challenge that would test not just his tactical skills, but the very limits of the radar technology his boat depended upon. Lieutenant Roger Payne, the Wahoo's radar operator, had been tracking a large convoy for the past 2 hours. The radar showed 7 distinct contacts, 6 cargo ships, and what appeared to be a destroyer escort, moving in a tight formation at approximately 9 knots. It was a tempting target, but the weather was deteriorating rapidly. Wind speeds had increased to 30 knots, and the seas were running at 12 to 15 feet. Spray was breaking over the Wahoo's bow, and every few minutes a larger wave would wash across the bridge, drenching the lookouts and sending cascades of seawater down the conning tower hatch. "Captain, I'm getting intermittent returns," Payne reported, his voice tight with frustration. "The radar picture keeps breaking up. I think we're getting interference from the wave tops. The antenna is probably getting hit by spray every time we take a wave over the bow." Morton studied the radar display, watching as the convoy contacts flickered in and out of existence. This was a problem the radar technicians at Pearl Harbor had warned about, but hadn't been able to fully solve. The SJ radar's antenna was mounted relatively low on the periscope shears, and in heavy seas, it could be obscured by wave tops or contaminated by seawater spray. The radar waves couldn't penetrate water, so every time a wave passed between the submarine and the target, the radar return would disappear. "Can you track them well enough to maintain contact?" Morton asked. "Barely, sir. I'm getting returns maybe 60% of the time. If the seas get any worse, we'll lose them completely." Morton faced a difficult decision. Standard doctrine called for breaking off the attack under these conditions. Trying to conduct a torpedo attack with unreliable radar data was asking for trouble. But this was exactly the kind of high-value convoy that the submarine force had been sent to destroy. 7 ships, probably carrying critical supplies to Japanese forces in China or Southeast Asia. If the Wahoo let them pass, those supplies would reach their destination, and American soldiers and Marines would face better-equipped Japanese forces as a result. "We're not breaking off," Morton decided. "Payne, I need you to work with the tracking party to develop a predictive solution. Use the intermittent returns to establish the convoy's base course and speed, then extrapolate their position during the periods when we lose radar contact. It won't be perfect, but it should get us close enough for a visual approach." It was an innovative solution, born of necessity. Instead of relying on continuous radar tracking, they would use the radar data they could get to build a mental picture of the convoy's movement, then fill in the gaps with calculated estimates. It required trust in mathematics, faith in the tracking party's skills, and a willingness to accept a higher degree of uncertainty than any submarine commander preferred. For the next 40 minutes, the Wahoo closed on the convoy using this hybrid approach. Payne would call out radar contacts when he could get them, and the tracking party would plot the positions on the chart. Between contacts, they would advance the convoy's estimated position based on the last known course and speed. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing, but slowly, painfully, a coherent picture emerged. At 03:15 hours, with the range down to 4,000 yards, disaster struck. A massive wave, larger than any they had encountered so far, crashed over the Wahoo's bow and swept across the bridge. The wall of water hit the radar antenna with tremendous force, and in the conning tower, Payne watched in horror as his radar display went completely dark. "Radar's down!" he shouted. "No returns at all. I think we've lost the antenna." Morton grabbed the voice tube to the bridge. "Bridge, con! What's the status of the radar antenna?" The reply came back immediately, shouted over the roar of wind and waves. "The antenna's still there, Captain, but it's not rotating. Looks like the drive motor might have been damaged by that last wave." Without radar, the Wahoo was blind again. The convoy was somewhere ahead in the darkness, probably less than 2 miles away, but Morton had no way to locate it precisely. The seas were too rough for reliable sound detection, and visual observation was impossible in the storm-tossed darkness. Every instinct told Morton to break off the attack, dive deep, and wait for better conditions. But Morton was not a man who gave up easily. "Payne, get up to the bridge and see if you can fix that antenna," Take whatever tools and parts you need. I'll hold our current course and speed. If your last plot was accurate, we should be on a collision course with the convoy." Payne grabbed a toolkit and a battle lantern and climbed up to the bridge, where he was immediately drenched by spray and buffeted by wind. The radar antenna, a small parabolic dish about 2 feet in diameter, was mounted on a rotating mechanism attached to the periscope shears. In the dim light of his battle lantern, Payne could see that the drive belt connecting the motor to the antenna had been torn loose by the force of the wave. Working in darkness, soaked to the skin, with the submarine pitching and rolling beneath him, Payne attempted to reattach the drive belt. His fingers, numb from cold and wet, fumbled with the small bolts and fasteners. Twice he dropped tools, watching helplessly as they bounced off the deck and disappeared into the sea. But he persisted, driven by the knowledge that 7 enemy ships were escaping while he struggled with a piece of machinery that had never been designed to operate in these conditions. Below, in the conning tower, Morton was conducting the attack using dead reckoning and intuition. Based on the last radar plot, he estimated the convoy should be approximately 3,000 yards ahead, on a course of roughly 270 degrees. He ordered the Wahoo to a course of 280 degrees, hoping to intercept the convoy's track at an angle that would allow a bow shot. "Captain, this is insane," said Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, the executive officer. "We have no idea where that convoy is. We could run right into the destroyer escort and not know it until we're under depth charge attack." "I know where they are," Morton replied with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "They're right where Payne's plot said they'd be. The Japanese don't maneuver in heavy weather. They maintain course and speed to avoid collisions within the convoy. We've got them." At 0342 hours, a lookout on the bridge shouted down the hatch, "Ships ahead, multiple contacts bearing 285, range approximately 1,500 yards. Morton felt a surge of triumph. His dead reckoning navigation had worked. They had found the convoy despite the loss of radar, but there was no time for celebration. At 1,500 yards, they were dangerously close, well within the range where the destroyer escort could detect them and launch a counterattack. "All ahead, flank! Come right to course 300, make ready tubes 1 through 6. The Wahoo leaped forward, her diesels roaring as she raced to achieve a firing position. Morton could see the dark shapes of the cargo ships now, massive silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky. The destroyer escort was visible too, a smaller, faster shape on the convoy's flank, its bow throwing up sheets of spray as it ploughed through the heavy seas. "Range to nearest target, 1,200 yards. O'Kane called out, his eye pressed to the target-bearing transmitter. "Angle on the bow, port 90. It's a big one, Captain. Looks like a tanker, maybe 10,000 tons. Morton made rapid calculations in his head. At this range, in these sea conditions, a spread of 3 torpedoes should be sufficient. Set depth 10 feet. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. The Wahoo shuddered as the torpedoes left their tubes. Morton counted down the seconds, watching the dark shape of the tanker through his binoculars. 45 seconds, 50 seconds, 55 seconds. The first torpedo struck the tanker amidships, and a massive fireball erupted into the night sky. The explosion was so bright that Morton had to shield his eyes, and the shockwave was powerful enough to be felt through the Wahoo's hull even at 1,200 yards distance. The tanker had been carrying aviation fuel, and the entire ship was now engulfed in flames that rose hundreds of feet into the air, illuminating the entire convoy. The second and third torpedoes hit almost simultaneously, one forward and one aft, and the tanker broke in half. Both sections remained afloat for a few moments, burning furiously, before sliding beneath the waves in clouds of steam and smoke. But there was no time to celebrate. The destroyer escort had seen the torpedo wakes and was turning toward the Wahoo, its bow wave growing larger as it accelerated to attack speed. Morton had perhaps 90 seconds before the destroyer would be in position to launch depth charges. "Crash dive! Take her down fast! Rig for depth charge!" The Wahoo's bow tilted sharply downward as her ballast tanks flooded and her dive planes bit into the water. The bridge watch tumbled down the hatch, and the conning tower hatch was slammed shut and dogged tight. On the bridge, still working frantically on the radar antenna, Lieutenant Payne suddenly realized the submarine was diving beneath him. "Wait!" he shouted, but his voice was lost in the wind. He dropped his tools and dove for the hatch, sliding down the ladder just as water began pouring through the opening. Strong hands grabbed him and pulled him clear, and the hatch was sealed with Payne, still gasping for breath on the conning tower deck. The Wahoo plunged toward the safety of deep water, her depth gauge spinning as she descended through 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet. Above them, they could hear the destroyer's propellers, a high-pitched whine that grew louder as the enemy ship passed overhead. Then came the depth charges. The first pattern of 5 charges exploded simultaneously, close enough that the Wahoo was lifted bodily by the shock waves. Light bulbs shattered, cork insulation rained down from the overhead, and men were thrown against bulkheads. A second pattern followed, then a third. The destroyer was conducting a methodical search, dropping charges in a grid pattern designed to saturate the area where the Wahoo had dived. For 2 hours, the depth charge attack continued. The Wahoo twisted and turned at 400 feet, using every evasion tactic Morton knew to shake the persistent destroyer. Twice, the submarine's hull groaned ominously as near-miss explosions stressed the pressure hull beyond its design limits. In the forward torpedo room, a small leak developed, spraying a fine mist of seawater that gradually filled the compartment with a cold fog. But the Wahoo survived. The destroyer, running low on depth charges and uncertain of its target's location, finally broke off the attack and returned to escort the remaining convoy ships. When Morton finally brought the Wahoo back to periscope depth at dawn, the sea was empty except for an oil slick and floating debris marking where the tanker had gone down. In the conning tower, Payne was already back at work on the radar. The drive belt he had been trying to repair was gone, lost when the submarine made its emergency dive. But during the long hours of the depth charge attack, Payne had been thinking. The radar didn't need a motor to rotate the antenna. It just needed the antenna to move. What if they could rotate it manually? Working with the boat's machinists, Payne fabricated a hand crank that could be attached to the antenna mount. It was crude, inefficient, and required a sailor to stand on the bridge turning the crank continuously, but it worked. The radar was operational again, and the Wahoo could continue hunting. When the Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor 3 weeks later, Payne's improvised hand crank system was studied by the radar technicians, who incorporated the lessons learned into improved antenna drive mechanisms for future installations. The problem of wave interference was addressed by mounting antennas higher on the periscope shears and adding protective shields. The issue of seawater contamination was solved with better sealing and drainage systems. Each crisis, each failure, each near disaster became a learning opportunity. The submarine force was evolving, adapting, and improving with every patrol. The radar technology that had seemed so fragile and unreliable just months earlier was becoming more robust, more dependable, and more deadly with each iteration. And in the process, American submarines were transforming from blind hunters into all-seeing predators that could strike at any time, in any weather, under any conditions. The Japanese merchant marine was about to discover just how dangerous that transformation would prove to be. By the summer of 1943, the transformation of American submarine warfare was complete. Over 100 submarines now prowled the Pacific equipped with SJ radar, and their commanders had developed tactics that exploited the technology's capabilities to devastating effect. The statistics told a story of systematic destruction that was strangling Japan's war economy. In June alone, American submarines sank 43 Japanese merchant ships, totaling over 200,000 tons. In July, the number climbed to 51 ships. In August, 62 ships went to the bottom, but the numbers, as staggering as they were, told only part of the story. The real impact was psychological, strategic, and ultimately catastrophic for Japan's ability to wage war. In Tokyo, at the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Escort Command, Vice Admiral Koshiro Oikawa stared at the loss reports with a sense of growing desperation. The pattern was now undeniable and terrifying. American submarines were no longer opportunistic raiders striking at isolated targets. They had become systematic hunters, capable of finding and destroying Japanese ships regardless of weather, darkness, or evasive routing. "They know where we are before we know where they are," Oikawa said to his staff during a briefing in early September. "Our captains report that attacks now come without warning, often from positions that should be impossible for a submarine to achieve. The Americans are tracking our convoys across hundreds of miles of ocean, maintaining contact through the night and striking at the moment of maximum vulnerability." Commander Yoshiro Tanaka, who had survived 3 separate submarine attacks while commanding escort vessels, provided a first-hand account that chilled everyone in the room. "Admiral, I have personally witnessed what these American submarines can do. In July, I was escorting a convoy of 5 ships from Singapore to Yokohama. We were traveling at night, maintaining strict radio silence, with a zigzag pattern designed to frustrate submarine attacks. At 2:30 hours, without any warning, the lead ship exploded. Before we could even begin a search pattern, the second ship was hit, then the third. The American submarine sank 3 ships in 11 minutes, and we never detected its presence until the torpedoes struck. It was as if we were being observed by an invisible eye that could see through darkness and anticipate our every move." Oikawa nodded grimly. "We now have confirmation from multiple sources that the Americans have equipped their submarines with radar. Our technical intelligence section has analyzed captured equipment and interrogated prisoners. The system they use operates at wavelengths around 10 centimeters, with effective range of 15 to 20 kilometers. It allows them to detect our ships, track our movements, and calculate firing solutions without ever exposing a periscope." "Can we detect these radar emissions?" asked Captain Hideaki Yamada, commander of the escort carrier Taiyo. "If we know when we're being observed, we could at least take evasive action." "We are working on detection equipment," Oikawa replied, "but it will be months before it can be deployed in significant numbers. And even then, detection only tells us we are being hunted. It does not prevent the attack. The Americans can track us from beyond the range of our own detection equipment, and their torpedoes can reach us long before we can reach them." The strategic implications were devastating. Japan's empire stretched across millions of square miles, from the home islands to the conquered territories of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Every resource needed to sustain the war effort, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, bauxite from the Philippines, had to be transported by ship across vast expanses of ocean. The merchant marine was the circulatory system of the empire, and American submarines were systematically severing every artery. The human cost was equally terrible. Japanese merchant sailors, once confident in their ability to evade submarine attacks through nighttime travel and evasive routing, now lived in constant fear. Morale plummeted as ship after ship failed to reach its destination. Experienced crews became increasingly difficult to recruit. Men who survived one sinking often refused to go back to sea, preferring disgrace to the terror of another night voyage through submarine-infested waters. Captain Saburo Nakamura, master of the cargo ship Hakone Maru, kept a diary during his final voyage in August 1943. His entries provided a haunting glimpse into the psychological impact of the submarine campaign. August 12th. Departed Balikpapan with full load of crude oil. Crew is nervous. 3 of the regular sailors deserted before departure and had to be replaced with inexperienced men. The new men are terrified, having heard stories of the ghost submarines that can see in darkness. August 14th, second night at sea. No one sleeps. Every sound, every shadow on the water causes panic. The lookouts report phantom periscopes that vanish when investigated. I try to maintain discipline, but I share their fear. We are blind, and the Americans can see. August 15th. Radio reports that 2 ships from the convoy ahead of us were sunk last night. Both attacks came in darkness, both without warning. The Americans are hunting us systematically like wolves culling a herd. We change course every hour, but I have no confidence it will help. If they can see us with their machines, our maneuvers are meaningless. August 16th, 0340 hours. Torpedoes struck the engine room. Ship is sinking. I have failed my crew, my company, my country. The Americans were there watching us, and we never knew until it was too late. Nakamura and 23 of his crew perished when the Hakonimaru sank. 17 survivors were picked up by a Japanese destroyer 3 days later, and their testimony was consistent with hundreds of other survivor accounts. The attack had come without warning, in complete darkness, with devastating accuracy. By September 1943, the Japanese Navy was forced to acknowledge a truth that fundamentally undermined their entire strategic position. They had lost control of the sea lanes. American submarines, equipped with radar and employing increasingly sophisticated tactics, could operate with near impunity throughout the Pacific. Japanese escort forces, hampered by inadequate equipment and outdated doctrine, were unable to protect the merchant convoys they were assigned to defend. The economic impact was catastrophic. Oil imports to Japan, which had averaged 1.5 million barrels per month in early 1943, dropped to 800,000 barrels per month by September. Rubber imports fell by 60%. Food shipments from Southeast Asia were cut in half. Industrial production began to decline as factories ran short of raw materials. The Japanese war machine, which had seemed invincible in 1942, was being slowly strangled by an invisible blockade, enforced by fewer than 100 American submarines. In the wardroom of the heavy cruiser Otago, flagship of the combined fleet, a group of senior officers gathered for an informal discussion that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Captain Toshikazu Ohmai, the fleet operations officer, spoke words that bordered on defeatism. "Gentlemen, we must face reality. The Americans have achieved technological superiority in submarine warfare that we cannot match. Their radar gives them capabilities that render our current defensive measures obsolete. Unless we can develop effective countermeasures and develop them quickly, we will lose this war not through defeat in battle, but through starvation and industrial collapse." Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the naval aviator who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was present at the meeting. His response captured the sense of frustration and helplessness that was spreading through the Japanese officer corps. "We trained for years to fight a decisive battle, a great clash of fleets that would determine the outcome of the war. But the Americans are not giving us that battle. Instead, they are destroying us piece by piece, ship by ship, with weapons we cannot see and cannot counter. How do you fight an enemy you cannot find? How do you defend against attacks that come without warning? The Americans have changed the nature of warfare, and we have no answer." The demoralization extended beyond the officer corps to the ordinary sailors and merchant seamen who bore the brunt of the submarine campaign. Letters intercepted by American intelligence painted a picture of an enemy force that was losing hope. One letter, written by a Japanese sailor to his family in October 1943, was particularly revealing. "Mother, I write this knowing I may not survive to send it. We are at sea, traveling through waters where the American submarines hunt. Every night is an agony of fear. We know they are out there watching us with their devil machines, waiting for the moment to strike. Our officers tell us to be brave, to trust in our training and our equipment. But what good is training against an enemy that can see through darkness? What good is courage against torpedoes that strike without warning? I have seen 3 ships sunk in the past month. Each time the attack came in the night, and each time there was nothing we could do. We are not fighting a war, we are waiting to die. By the end of 1943, the strategic situation had become untenable for Japan. The submarine blockade, enabled by radar technology and executed by increasingly skilled American submarine crews, had reduced Japanese merchant shipping capacity by nearly 40%. The oil refineries of the Dutch East Indies continued to produce, but the tankers that should have carried that oil to Japan were resting on the bottom of the Pacific. The rubber plantations of Malaya were still operating, but the cargo ships that should have transported rubber to Japanese factories were scattered across the ocean floor in pieces. Admiral Osamu Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, submitted a report to Prime Minister Hideki Tojo that laid out the grim reality in stark terms. The American submarine campaign has achieved what their surface fleet could not: the effective isolation of the home islands from the resources of our southern territories. Current loss rates are unsustainable. If they continue at present levels, we will be unable to maintain military operations beyond mid-1944. The technological advantage possessed by American submarines, specifically their radar equipment, has proven decisive. We have no effective countermeasures, and our attempts to develop them have been too slow and too limited in scope. The report concluded with a sentence that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. We are losing the war at sea, and unless the situation changes dramatically, we will lose the war entirely. In the cold calculus of naval warfare, the SJ radar had proven to be one of the most decisive weapons of the Pacific War. It had transformed American submarines from blind hunters into all-seeing predators. It had turned the night from a refuge into a killing ground, and it had demonstrated that technological innovation, properly applied, could overcome numerical inferiority and achieve strategic effects far beyond what conventional weapons could accomplish. The Japanese merchant marine, once the proud lifeline of an empire, had become a fleet of floating coffins, their crews sailing into darkness knowing that invisible eyes were watching, invisible hunters were stalking, and death could come at any moment without warning or mercy. The psychological impact of this knowledge was as devastating as the physical destruction of ships and cargo. An enemy that cannot be seen, cannot be fought, and cannot be escaped is an enemy that destroys not just ships, but hope itself. And hope, once lost, is the hardest thing to regain. The war in the Pacific ended on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender in a radio broadcast that marked the conclusion of the most devastating conflict in human history. In the aftermath, as historians and military analysts began to assess the factors that had led to Japan's defeat, one weapon emerged as having played a disproportionately significant role: the radar-equipped American submarine. The final statistics were staggering. Between December 1941 and August 1945, American submarines sank 1,114 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5.3 million tons. Approximately 55% of all Japanese merchant vessels lost during the war. They also sank 214 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. These achievements came at a cost of 52 American submarines lost, with 3,505 submariners killed in action, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the U.S. military, at 22%. But the raw numbers, impressive as they were, did not fully capture the strategic impact of the submarine campaign. Japan's war economy had been built on the assumption that merchant shipping could move resources from conquered territories to the home islands with acceptable losses. The introduction of radar-equipped submarines in 1943 shattered that assumption, creating a blockade that was more effective than any surface fleet could have achieved. In November 1945, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive interviews with Japanese military and civilian leaders to assess the factors that had contributed to Japan's defeat. Admiral Oikawa, who had commanded the escort command throughout the war, provided testimony that was both candid and devastating. The American submarine campaign, particularly after they introduced radar in 1943, was the single most effective weapon employed against Japan. We could not defend against it, we could not counter it, and we could not sustain our war effort in the face of it. The radar gave American submarines a capability that was, from our perspective, almost supernatural. They could find our ships in any weather, at any time, and attack with precision that made evasion impossible. By 1944, we had effectively lost the ability to transport resources from our southern territories to the home islands. This loss was fatal to our war effort. The technological legacy of the submarine radar program extended far beyond the immediate military applications. The SJ radar system, which had been developed under intense pressure and refined through combat experience, represented a quantum leap in miniaturized electronics and signal processing. The lessons learned from designing radar systems that could operate in the harsh environment of a submarine, subjected to shock, vibration, temperature extremes and saltwater exposure, would inform the development of electronics for decades to come. Dr. Robert Page, who had led the radar development program at the Naval Research Laboratory, reflected on the achievement in a 1947 interview. When we started the SJ program in 1941, many people thought it was impossible. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. How do you create a radar system powerful enough to detect ships at useful ranges, yet compact enough to fit on a submarine? How do you make it reliable enough to operate in combat conditions, yet simple enough that sailors with minimal training could maintain it? We solved those problems through innovation, persistence, and the willingness to learn from failure. Every submarine that went to sea with our radar became a floating laboratory, and every patrol report provided data that helped us improve the system. By the end of the war, the SJ radar was so reliable and effective that submarine commanders considered it as essential as their periscopes or torpedoes. The human stories behind the technology were equally compelling. Lieutenant Roger Payne, who had improvised the hand crank antenna repair on the USS Wahoo, survived the war and went on to become a professor of electrical engineering at MIT. His experiences operating radar under combat conditions informed his teaching and research for the next 3 decades. In a 1968 lecture to his students, Payne described the moment when he realized the radar had fundamentally changed naval warfare. It was during my 3rd patrol in the summer of 1943. We detected a Japanese convoy at a range of 18 miles in complete darkness during a rainstorm. We tracked that convoy for 6 hours, maintaining perfect contact the entire time, and sank 4 ships without ever making visual contact. As I watched those radar returns on my screen, I understood that we had achieved something revolutionary. We had given human beings the ability to see beyond the limitations of their own eyes. That capability would change not just warfare, but the entire relationship between humans and their environment. Commander Dudley Morton, whose aggressive tactics and innovative use of radar had made him one of the war's most successful submarine commanders, did not survive to see the peace. The USS Wahoo was lost with all hands in October 1943, probably sunk by Japanese aircraft in the La Perouse Strait. Morton's final patrol report, filed before his last mission, contained a passage that captured his philosophy of submarine warfare. "The radar has given us the night. We no longer need to fear darkness or poor visibility. These conditions now favor us, not the enemy." Every submarine commander must learn to trust the radar, to use it aggressively, and to exploit the advantages it provides. The Japanese cannot see us, but we can see them. That asymmetry is the key to victory. The strategic lessons of the submarine campaign were studied intensively by naval planners in the post-war period. The U.S. Navy's official history, published in 1949, concluded that the submarine force had achieved strategic effects far beyond what its size would suggest. With fewer than 200 submarines in the Pacific at any given time, the submarine force effectively blockaded an island empire of 70 million people. This achievement was made possible by technological superiority, specifically radar, combined with aggressive tactics and excellent training. The submarine campaign demonstrated that a relatively small force, properly equipped and employed, could achieve strategic effects that would require vastly larger conventional forces. The Soviet Union, which had observed American submarine operations with great interest, immediately began developing its own submarine radar systems after the war. British, French, and eventually all major naval powers followed suit. By 1950, submarine-mounted radar had become standard equipment on all modern submarines, and the tactics developed by American submariners in the Pacific had been incorporated into naval doctrine worldwide. But perhaps the most profound legacy was the demonstration that technological innovation could be decisive in warfare. The SJ radar program had taken a concept that many considered impractical, refined it through intensive development and testing, and deployed it in combat where it proved to be war-winning. This model, rapid development, iterative improvement based on operational feedback and close cooperation between scientists and operators, would become the template for military technology development throughout the Cold War and beyond. Admiral Charles Lockwood, who had championed the radar program despite initial skepticism, and who had commanded the submarine force through its most successful period, retired in 1947. In his memoirs, published in 1951, he reflected on the transformation he had witnessed. When I took command of the submarine force in 1943, our boats were sinking Japanese ships at a rate that was useful but not decisive. The introduction of radar changed everything. Within 6 months, our effectiveness had doubled. Within a year, we had achieved maritime superiority throughout the Pacific. The Japanese could not move supplies, could not reinforce their garrisons, could not sustain their war effort. We had cut the arteries of their empire, and they bled to death slowly but inevitably. The radar made this possible. It was not the only factor in our victory, but it was certainly one of the most important. In Japan, the memory of the submarine campaign remained painful for decades. Merchant sailors who had survived multiple sinkings carried psychological scars that never fully healed. The terror of sailing through darkness, knowing that invisible hunters were watching, had left an indelible mark. Yoshiro Tanaka, the escort commander who had witnessed the destruction of 3 ships in 11 minutes, wrote in his 1956 memoir, "We were brave men, trained and disciplined, but we were fighting an enemy we could not see and could not counter. The Americans' radar gave them a godlike ability to observe and strike at will. We felt helpless, impotent, doomed. That feeling, that sense of inevitable defeat, was as destructive to morale as the physical loss of ships. When men believe they cannot win, they have already lost." The technological race that had produced the SJ radar also foreshadowed the nature of modern warfare. The side with superior technology, properly employed, could achieve decisive advantages that traditional measures of military strength, numbers of ships, size of armies, industrial capacity, could not overcome. This lesson would be relearned repeatedly in subsequent conflicts, from the electronic warfare of Vietnam to the precision-guided munitions of the Gulf War to the drone warfare of the 21st century. By the 1960s, submarine technology had advanced far beyond the diesel-electric boats of World War II. Nuclear propulsion allowed submarines to remain submerged indefinitely, and sophisticated sonar systems had largely replaced radar for underwater detection. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. The submarine that could detect its enemy first, from beyond the range at which it could be detected, held an overwhelming advantage. The SJ radar had demonstrated this principle in the crucible of the Pacific War, and that demonstration had shaped naval warfare for generations to come. In 2003, the USS Wahoo was located by underwater explorers in the La Perouse Strait, resting in 213 feet of water. The wreck was remarkably well preserved, and among the debris field, researchers identified the remains of the SJ radar antenna, the same antenna that Lieutenant Payne had repaired with a hand crank 60 years earlier. The discovery prompted renewed interest in the submarine's history and the role of radar in the Pacific War. At the dedication of a memorial to the Wahoo's crew in 2006, Admiral Michael Mullen, Chief of Naval Operations, spoke about the legacy of the radar-equipped submarines. These men went to war in boats that were cramped, dangerous, and uncomfortable. They faced an enemy that was determined, skilled, and ruthless, but they had one crucial advantage: they could see in the dark. That advantage, born of American ingenuity and refined through American courage, helped win the war in the Pacific. We honor their memory not just by remembering their sacrifice, but by continuing their tradition of technological innovation and tactical excellence. The submarines of today are vastly more capable than the Wahoo, but they operate on the same principle: see first, strike first, win. That principle, proven in the dark waters of the Pacific 70 years ago, remains the foundation of submarine warfare today. The story of radar-equipped submarines in World War II is ultimately a story about the power of innovation to change the course of history. A small group of scientists and engineers working under intense pressure created a technology that seemed impossible. A cadre of submarine commanders willing to trust unproven equipment and develop new tactics turned that technology into a decisive weapon. And thousands of submariners, operating in conditions of extreme danger and discomfort, executed a campaign that helped bring the war to a successful conclusion. The night, which had been humanity's refuge since the dawn of time, had become transparent. The darkness that had protected Japanese merchant ships had been pierced by electromagnetic radiation traveling at the speed of light. And in that transformation, from blindness to sight, from helplessness to dominance, from defense to offense, lay a lesson that would echo through the decades. In warfare, as in life, the ability to see clearly is the first step toward victory. The Japanese captains who had felt safe at night learned this lesson too late. By the time they understood that American submarines could hunt them in darkness, the war was already lost. The radar had not just sunk ships, it had sunk an empire. The story of how American submarines turned the Pacific night into a hunting ground is one of the most remarkable technological and tactical transformations in military history. From the first experimental installation on the USS Haddock to the systematic destruction of Japan's merchant fleet, radar technology proved that innovation and courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. These submariners, men like Commander Morton, Lieutenant Payne, and thousands of others whose names have faded from memory, fought a war in cramped steel tubes beneath the waves, armed with a technology that gave them eyes in the darkness. They faced depth charges, equipment failures, and an enemy that fought with desperate determination, yet they persevered, refined their tactics, and ultimately achieved one of the most decisive campaigns of World War II. The legacy of their achievement extends far beyond the ships they sank or the battles they won. They demonstrated that technological superiority combined with tactical innovation and unwavering courage could change the course of history. The principles they established, see first, strike first, adapt constantly, remain fundamental to naval warfare today. If you found this story of innovation, courage, and technological warfare fascinating, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you know about the role of radar in submarine warfare? What other hidden technologies of WR2 would you like us to explore? Hit the like button if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, and don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss our next story. History is full of remarkable tales of human ingenuity and bravery. Join us as we continue to uncover them, one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most decisive battles are fought not with the largest guns, but with the sharpest minds.